Hello and welcome to episode 174 of the Board Game Barrage podcast. I am Mark, the green tank, and with me as always are Neelan, the orange tank.
Hello.
And Kellen, the red tank.
You're trying to switch up the order this time so one of us goes,
You were drinking.
Hello.
I was trying to help you out here.
Oh, wow.
See, look at that. I was on the fly. I usually go
Classy.
you, then Neelan, and did a little reversal. Last second audible. So in the early days of Board Game Barrage, we took a look at legacy games. And this week, in celebration of our Cinco de Ocho redo.
That doesn't make any sense to anyone who knows Spanish.
And makes less and less sense as it continues to...
Oh, well, it didn't make sense to start with, so
yeah.
The fact that it makes less sense is not really a big deal. But we finally got Cinco de Ocho done.
After recovering from the murder.
Right,
Yeah.
right.
It turns out I'm not guilty.
We were all so happy. And got a chance to play a couple legacy games during the acquittal celebration. Legacy board games, for those who don't know, are games that are played over and over again where the state of the game can change from play to play. So you might attach stickers to the board, you might tear up cards. The game sort of changes course and is different from game to game as you play it. And so we thought we would take another look at legacy games in this episode. But before we do that, we're going to be talking about the games we've played. Neelan's going to start us off talking about Bonfire. I will follow up with Nidavellir. And Kellen...
And that's a place, right?
It's a place in your heart. And Kellen will discuss our game of The King's Dilemma, or our games. Or was it a game, or was it a games? More about that later. Who can say if a game in a legacy game counts as a single game, or is it part of a bigger game? It's all very complicated. But let's get into them. Neelan, tell us about Bonfire.
Bonfire is one of the latest games from Mr. Stefan Feld, who is a designer whom I think we typically have a mixed opinion of. I love a couple of his games, but have not traditionally loved all of his games. But I'm always intrigued to try a new Stefan Feld game because there is something about the intricacy of his designs and kind of what feels like a solid design mathematical underpinning to them that always feels very interesting to me. The premise of Bonfire is that there are these tasks which are spread out across the board, all representing different bonfires. And each of these tasks you can think of as just almost an absurd selection of just little micro achievements. So there are 66 of them total in the box, and about 30 of them will come out in a 4-player game, less if you have less players. So every game you just have a random assortment of these different tasks. They represent all sorts of different things. Visit this island, collect 4 of this type of component, get this much of this thing. So the
Wood.
What's that?
Get wood.
No, not actually in this game. The resources have a lot of really weird names to them. There's like mandrake root and all sorts of weird little resources in this. But the tasks are pretty diverse in what's required of them, and they're sort of scaled by difficulty. So there are these blue tasks that will get you a few victory points but are easy. Medium tasks will get you more but are slightly harder. And then the really hard yellow tasks. And they're evenly spread across these islands. So one core part of the game is taking your little ship, visiting these islands, picking up a task, saying, you know what, I think I'm going to be able to fulfill this one. You place it on your board, you do all the other things that I'll come back to in a second, and eventually you fulfill one of these tasks. You flip it over and it's going to be worth victory points at the end of the game. But in order to make all of this work, the reason that the game allows the possibility of this many types of tasks is because there is so much other stuff spread around the edges that makes up the core of Bonfire. Whether that's the crazy sort of action process whereby you're almost doing like a tile laying puzzle to get action tiles, which you spend to perform actions. You're turning this bonfire dial to collect resources. You're getting specialist cards. You're sending gnomes out to the circle. You're collecting guardians, which will then have to visit your bonfires via paths that you're assembling and portals that connect the paths and things. If this all sounds like a lot, it really, really is. It's kind of this almost like absurd collection of stuff that you have to do for the process of fulfilling these tasks. And in sort of very classical Stefan Feld fashion, all of these things are going to reward you varying amounts of points when it comes to the end of the game. Do you have paths connected to these bonfires? You'll get some points. Do you have portals connected to these bonfires? You'll get some points. Have your guardians visited these bonfires? Points. Do the colors match on the bonfires? Points. It's that sort of game, but it is built around this pretty cool core about just having this myriad of tasks of varying sort of difficulties and sort of varying goals in order to fulfill. I almost don't want to go into the mess of things that make up all of the mechanics around the game because there's a lot to it. I will say that a lot of it just doesn't really feel like any other game. Like, I could describe the action system, but again, it's this weird thing where every so often you have to lay some tiles, and whether those symbols match, you'll get more tiles of a specific type. And you can spend those tiles on a given turn in order to do an action at varying strengths. The Guardians have to move along the path and get to their bonfires. There's just a lot going on in this. But I do find the core concept of this, these choose the tasks that you think you're going to be able to do and which ones your boat is close enough in order to collect, like that tension between those two goals and whether you think you're going to be able to complete any of these tasks before the game ends because there's sort of a variable clock in the game. Pretty cool. But I don't think that the design as a whole feels streamlined enough to justify all of that, because I do think it's like also a game of inches where you sort of have to do a lot over a large amount of turns in order to scrabble the small amount of resources you need in order to accomplish these tasks. Often your turn is as simple as, okay, I'll turn the dial here, get a resource, and then eventually that resource will lead to being able to get a new task or something like that. Now, Mark, I know that you've played this a few months ago. What did you think of Bonfire?
So I can't remember the details, and I have to say you've done a Herculean task of like actually trying to connect the theme with the game, because the theme is like crazy. It's like,
yes,
druids and bonfires and islands. I mean, it's definitely pasted on, but it's also weird.
Totally.
The theme is weirding me out right now, right? Because another one of Steppenfeld's games, right? The Castles of Burgundy. The act of building a castle and an accompanying village is harder than the gameplay. The mechanisms are significantly streamlined, right? We go to Vital Lacerda, Kanban, running a car factory, an automotive factory, is significantly harder than the gameplay. But what you have described thus far about building a bonfire, it seems that the mechanisms are significantly harder than actually just building a bonfire.
But have you ever built a bonfire with druids?
Yes, these are magical bonfires, Kellen.
Exactly.
Oh, I see.
So I have to admit that I don't remember the game in great detail. I do remember enjoying it, but not thinking it was like anything remarkable. Like, it wasn't a game that I had much desire to play again, and in fact I have not played it since that time. I do remember that one of the players that I played it with, who is normally a big fan of Feld games in general, really did not like it because he found it too constraining. He said that he's not the type of player who is interested in games where he feels very constrained, like he's not going to be able to do everything he wants. And that really put him off. And unfortunately, I don't remember the game well enough to remember how really that manifests itself in the game.
I can speak to that thing you described a little bit, because there is one thing that did strike me that you're reminding me of now, Mark, which is one of the things that happened in my game of this was that everything just came together for me in the last couple of turns, and like I felt like I had this big play on my second last turn that was like, oh, ba-bam, 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 move all my guardians onto their bonfires, get a lot of points. I didn't win that game, but I can imagine a scenario where that doesn't click together.
Right.
And you're just like, well, I accomplished nothing. I spent,
so hard.
I worked so hard. Yeah, exactly. I spent an hour and a half and a half-hour rules explanation on this crazy, like, brain-burny game, and I got nothing to show for it. I think you're going to have games that you're going to feel like everything just like perfectly added up to the great turn and the strong finish, and games where it's just going to feel like none of that happened. And I can see why that would be massively frustrating. And for what it's worth, even though I had that cool moment to me, it wasn't enough to salvage a lot of just feeling that throughout the course of the game. Like, I was just doing a lot of intense scrutiny and a lot of sort of brain-burning calculation for not that much continual reward. It's such a weird one because, as with a lot of Felds, I sort of admire the novelty of it. I think the theme is cute, even if it is pasted on, like, it at least is interesting. And the art is by Dennis Lohassen, who is the guy who did Terra Mystica's art. So it has that kind of like fantastical feel to it. It's cutesy, but you're right. It does feel pretty much not one-to-one with the mechanics. It could have been anything, really.
Right.
So I think it's an interesting, heavy Feld, but not one that I felt especially strong about revisiting.
TLDR, play Macau.
Macau is very good. But that is going to cover everything I have to say about Bonfire by Stefan Feld.
I got a chance to play Nidavellir a couple times on BGA. They've got a really good implementation. Nidavellir is the newest game from Serge Leger. he of Shadows over Camelot, one of the first semi-cooperative hidden trader games. Nidavellir is not a semi-co-op hidden trader game. It is a competitive game where you are blind bidding for cards in a sort of a set collection fashion. So the way that Nidavellir works is there are 5 suits of cards. In the end, they will score in different fashions. The purple and green cards sort of have a set collection aspect to them where the more cards you have, the more points you're going to score in a sort of exponential manner. They score slightly differently, but that's basically the gist of it. The blue cards just score the points that are on the face of the card. So if a blue card has a 10 on it, that blue card in the end will be worth 10 points, and you'll be getting all the points you've accumulated on the blue cards. The red cards will score similarly to the blue cards insofar as you'll be scoring the face value of the red cards. But in addition to that, if you have the most red points of anybody in the game, you will be scoring the highest value coin you possess as well as sort of a bonus. More about coins later. The orange cards will have sort of a multiplicative scoring where you will score the number of orange cards you possess multiplied by the face value of all the orange cards. Now the orange cards, instead of having values like 10, 11, 12 like the other cards, they will only be 0, 1, and 2. So if you have 3 orange cards and their value 2, 1, and 0, you will be scoring 3 times 3 for the 3 orange cards you have, times 3 for the face value of the combined orange cards. So that's the basic way the 5 suits score. The way that you acquire the cards is there will be 3 sets of cards dealt out at the beginning of every round, each set consisting of a number of cards equal to the number of players. So in a 3-player game, there will be 3 sets of 3 cards. Each player has 5 coins, each coin with a different value on it. And you're going to be placing face down next to each set one of your coins. Once everybody has placed the coins face down on each set, you're going to reveal the coins. Whoever has the highest coin gets first pick. The second highest coin will get the next pick, and so on and so forth until each player has taken a card from the set. In addition, everybody has a special 0 coin, which is a value of 0, but when it comes up, whatever 2 coins you haven't used, because you've used 3 of your 5 coins every round, whichever 2 coins you haven't used, so say I haven't used my 3 and my 2, you get to exchange the higher one, in this case the 3, for a new coin whose value is like the combined value of those 2 coins. So for example, if I use my 0 coin and the 2 coins I didn't use are the 3 and the 2, I exchange the 3 for a 5, which gives me better bidding power in future rounds. So you don't have to use that 0 coin. You can use one of your higher value coins, but you don't get that increased coin value for later bidding. That's basically how the game works. In addition, there is an incentive not to go hard in any one color and to diversify, because your inclination is, if purple or if green has this exponential set collection idea, why not go hard in one of those? Well, the reason you don't want to is because once you have an even number of cards in every color, you get to draw a hero card. So this is like a collection of cards that is set aside, and once you have 1 of every color and then 2 of every color, and once you have a set of every color, you get to pick one of these heroes who give you extreme bonuses. For example, one of the heroes will give you basically the equivalent of 3 purple cards. One will give you, say, 20 points in blue. So you want to have diversification in order to recruit these high-scoring hero cards. Some of them are even game-breaking. One hero, my favorite, for example, will allow you to not bid, so you don't bid when the bidding phase comes up. Instead, you wait until everybody has bid, they reveal their bids, and then you get to place your coins. So there can be quite extreme powers that are unlocked in these hero cards. I think the implementation, as I said, on BGA is really great. Game moves really fast, and I really enjoyed it. I like auction bidding type of games. The set collection decisions, whether to go hard in something and therefore sacrifice getting these bonus heroes, is an interesting decision to make. Sometimes, you'll see the cards that are available at the beginning of a round, and you'll see, like, I need an orange card, and there's one orange card among all these cards available, and it's in the 3rd set of cards. I need to make sure to bid high on that one set because I need to have that. Neelan, you've played Nidavellir.
Yeah.
What did you think of it?
So I've also only played it on BGA, and I will definitely reiterate that Board Game Arena, I think, continues to knock it out of the park with their more recent implementations. This is another solid one. I think that the basic core of Nidavellir is so solid because it is really, really simple. It's put out a coin, get a card, and occasionally be frustrated because someone outbid you on the card that you wanted, right? That's the key point of interaction. I really hope that my best coin is good enough for this row of cards so that I get the card that I know I want because I'm going hard into green or purple or what have you. And then you just happen to see out of the corner of your eye, it's like, oh, wait, no, I know that Dan has a coin that's higher than this, but is he going to use it on that row? Do I think he's going to use it on this row? And there's a little bit of that second guessing and the reveal once everyone brings out their coins and you're either relieved or frustrated. That's the great part. But I do think that the core of what surrounds that is a relatively simple set collection game. You know, you are just collecting these dwarves for their numeric value on them, right? And that value either squares or multiplies or adds together. And that felt a little bit unexciting to me. There aren't like powers associated with these until you get into the heroes. But I think it's such a very smooth, pleasant, accessible game that I'm willing to forgive that sort of lack of greater complexity, because it's just a very fun outbid a player for the cards you want. I mean, that's the game, and it doesn't promise to be anything more or less than that.
I think the trade of complexity with more powers, for example, versus a simpler game where it's just, in a lot of cases, straight set collection, I think that's a good trade. At least in this case, it makes the game, you know, quick and easy to teach and easy to play. There's not a lot of rules. It's not overly complicated.
Actually, and come to think of it, I do think that the expansion does add some like card powers into the game.
Oh, Nidavellir?
Yeah, I've not touched that yet, but I probably ought to give that a go, because that maybe sounds like the little twist that I'm missing to like really elevate it for me.
Sure.
I've done a lot of research on this game, and this conversation has actually puzzled me a little more than clarified. So you've said a couple times how simple it is, in some ways approaching like filler plus territory, but you did spend like 5 minutes explaining it. And then it's set collecting. I've heard like it's like Coloretto, but crazy. It's like Libertalia, but super streamlined back. I'm having trouble from a weight perspective, sort of saying, is this like Biblios adjacent? And then the production is very like lavish and big.
Right.
So I'm having trouble. When am I playing this at game night?
I think Filler Plus is pretty much on. I think this is like a step up from Splendor and that kind of thing, but not too far up from that.
But in that ballpark, right? It's like a half-hour game that is going to be explained relatively... Like, the way the dwarves score is the most complex part of it, and, like, you explain that once at the beginning and then never think about it again.
And as Nealon said, like, it really comes down to set collection and, like, very simple, in most cases, just adding up the points on these cards.
Yeah. I actually, based on nothing but my own intuition and what I've read and what you've said, I think that this game was helped by BGA, because I've read that both the setup and the scoring is annoying.
Right.
And that the last 5 minutes are just people heads down with calculators, and the production looks a little too much for the level of gameplay that you guys are talking about. That's exciting.
Yeah.
For the right audience, but I wonder if, you know, we have some board games that have been artificially made more important or more accepted because they've got such a great BGA implementation versus the pandemic.
And that's a very good point, because the scores at the end of these games tend to be in the like 200 range. And so I can see if you had a physical copy of this game, there would be a lot of adding up scores, you know, for each column and putting them all together and that kind of stuff. I can't see that being tedious.
I do say this as someone who's excited to play it and has pre-ordered both the game and the expansion.
Oh, okay.
So I'm excited to try this one.
So that is Nidavellir by Serge Leger.
So the game that I will be covering may bleed into the main topic, and at any point Mark may stop me and say, and now for our featured topic. But The King's Dilemma is a premier negotiation legacy game that was all the rage just a few short years ago. It was on our most anticipated list, most excited to get at Gen Con, most excited of the year to play, and it has been sitting in my closet. There has been multiple murders on different nights that prevented us from starting the game. This is a game that I have learned the rules for at least 3 times now, in literal anticipation. I've had it out on the table when a murder took place, and then we had to save it. So The King's Dilemma, and one of the hardest things to talk about with legacy games is twofold. One, you don't want to spoil it for people. And 2, the opinion on a legacy game may change after you've played it 12 times versus playing it only a few times. That makes it hard to talk about from a board game media perspective. But we will do our best. We will be doing our best not to spoil things, because that is no fun. And I personally am extremely spoiler averse as a human being. So there's my prerequisite. In the King's Dilemma, you are playing as royal houses, and I'm sure I'm going to butcher some of this theme. Anyone who knows me knows that I'm not the theme-forward person, but the king has his houses that are all competing over different objectives. They all have different wants within the kingdom. So each game of the King's Dilemma is one king's reign. And by the end of that game, the king will have either died or abdicated due to positivity in their kingdom or due to negativity in their kingdom. There are sort of the general state of the kingdom as defined by the morale level, the wealth level, the military level, the health level, etc., etc. And the primary function of the game is actually voting. So a dilemma will come out, and it will have consequences. It will say, something has happened in ye gone kingdom, and the people need to know, shall we build more bathrooms? And then it'll say, obvious implications of this are, if we build the bathrooms, our money is going to go down. And if we build the bathrooms, our people are going to be healthier. And if we don't do this, what's going to happen? Well, we're going to save money. And so each dilemma has both the story component and then a likely outcome component to it. It doesn't tell you everything that happens, but it sort of alludes to what's happening. And then everyone will vote, and we'll get into how voting works, to pass or not pass that dilemma. And you may ask, well, does Kellen care about building bathrooms? Does Neelan care about building bathrooms? Well, you have a house that has its own set of sort of achievements, that they're a narrative goal that they're trying to get to over the course of the entirety of the King's Dilemma. And then you also have a secret agenda card that is telling you how you want the sort of society to end up at the end of that game. Whether you want all resources to be really high, whether you want them all to be low, whether you want some to be high and some to be low, whether you want to hoard money. So you are balancing your secret agenda, okay? You are balancing some public agendas that you may have and your house's narrative and achievement goals, in addition to balancing the ethical and moral framework of like real problems. So, I've made light of the fact that, building a bathroom is not in the game, but there are dilemmas that have to do with things like slavery, with death, with killing, with providing resources for this group, with immigration, literally. So the front of the rulebook literally says like, hey, this is not easy. People said, Board Game Barrage should stream this. And I read the first page of the rulebook and said, no, Board Game Barrage will not be streaming The King's Dilemma. The voting system is very, very clever. The first person must vote first and publicly, the leader, and you commit power to yes, no, or pass. And passing is how you get more power. We won't go into all the details of how the voting works, but it works extremely well, and it also allows you to care more about certain dilemmas than other dilemmas. It's not just everyone has a pass and fail. It's no, how much power do I want to commit to this? If the way that you don't want a dilemma to go doesn't pass, you get your power back. And if you don't want anything to do with it, you can just pass and collect more power so that you have more influence over a subsequent dilemma. Now we've explained how a game works of the King's Dilemma, but then, right, you've also got the legacy, the campaign. You're doing things to the board. Stories are happening that are ongoing, that will happen across the entire campaign. And you are trying to achieve prestige points and these black crown points called crave points to ultimately determine who the winner, quote unquote, of the campaign is. That is the King's Dilemma in slightly large nutshell. Mark and Neelan, how did you enjoy our first 3 games of the King's Dilemma?
I enjoyed it quite a bit. I was very pleasantly surprised, as you mentioned, the voting system is done quite cleverly, which I really enjoyed. It almost has like a tempo aspect, and I mentioned a bunch. I'm very big into tempo, so based on where you're sitting and based on how people vote, there's a consideration as to, do I go hard now? Do I sort of sit back? Do I sell my vote? Which is something I was doing quite often in the game. Kellen mentioned that if you're not interested, you can pass and gather more power for later votes. But instead of passing, you can just put your votes up for bid. You can say, like, I don't care if this passes or not. Hey, people who want this to pass, pay me. Hey, people who don't want this to pass, pay me. Which is fun sort of interaction sort of thing. Also, in terms of the gamification of a negotiation game, I sort of liked how it sort of walked the line because, again, as Kellen mentioned, there is this narrative overarching thread that each house has that is sort of nebulous. You are sort of like given some goal that is not concrete. It's just like you are searching after whatever. And I don't want to do any spoilers, but like...
Well, no. I think there are over 10 factions, and they all have a different narrative achievement that you can read right when you open the box.
Right. So, yeah, I guess it's not spoilery. But so, for example, one faction, my faction, for example, our goal is to achieve immortality. Another faction is to conquer another kingdom, which is a little more concrete than achieve immortality. But there are these just narrative goals, these general narrative goals, but also you also have much more concrete goals. So, for example, my overarching narrative goal is to achieve immortality, but I have a goal where every game I'm trying to end the game with 18 coins, and I'm trying to end every game with the kingdom more stable than unstable. So there are concrete per game goals, but there's also this overarching narrative thing, and the way you're sort of playing both sides, I think, is done very well in that respect.
Yeah, I think for me, there were like two major things that pleasantly surprised me about King's Dilemma, and the one of them is actually exactly what Mark was just talking about. Like, I think that the voting in this game could easily have devolved into, okay, everyone thumbs up, thumbs down, and there's some sort of tiebreaker, and then you repeat that. But there is like this gamery core to the voting, which is like this bidding system where it's kind of like, okay, if I bid 1, then Kellen would have to go up by this much to beat me, or if I bid 2, then they would both have to combine to beat me. There is like some thinking and some strategy behind how much you bid and what you bid on and when you pass and when to sell your vote, because the only thing money is good for is for negotiating with people, but it also has value at the end of the game if you have a lot of it. So there are some cool mechanics just around this voting structure that I think make it work really well. And I think that the reason that's important is because the flip side of this is something like A Fog of Love, which is a game that I didn't enjoy all that much, where your only real decision is, well, am I role-playing this character, or am I just trying to do the obvious thing that's going to get me to win? Having like a more solid game core makes that decision a little bit more fluid over the course of the game, whether or not you have power to even help you achieve the votes that you need to. The other thing that I was very pleasantly surprised by is I had this fear that this was going to require a lot of role-playing to really get the most out of it. But I think that the game very cleverly gives you just enough loose structure and just enough actual honest-to-goodness gameplay that you can thread that needle of deciding how much you want to roleplay your house, you know? Are you like this righteous faction as written on your card, or are you just going to be more wishy-washy depending on what the game requires of you at a given time? And because of the fact that you're ostensibly actually playing a different character in every subsequent game, it gives you the leeway to kind of go whichever way you want to with it. Are you greedy this game? Are you for the good of the kingdom in the next game? Like, it changes. I thought that was really, really smart.
I think that I mostly disagree with your second point. I think that the mechanisms of the game are super solid, and even the momentum system, which is like really clever. It's like if wealth has increased, then the next time wealth increase, it goes up even more. Or if you are really influential in helping the military, then that echoes into subsequent games where Kingdom Mark is known for being pro-military and vice versa, right? You could get a benefit that you really need in one game, but it's actually, you see that it's going to have a negative consequence on your like generations of people, which I think is like fascinating and fun. But to your second point, the balance of, do I care about the ethical or storytelling aspects of this versus the gameplay? I feel like we had a great time, but I don't feel like under a microscope it actually makes very much sense, if at all.
So I agree with you broadly, but I think there is one specific thing that does really smartly, right? Which is that from turn to turn, that point changes a little, because there will be some turns where you really care about the game outcome. The morale is on the edge of the border of where you actually care about it, and it's about to go out of that border, so you're going to do everything in your power to push it back down. And in that vote, all that matters is the game. This is going to cost me victory points if this moves up, so screw my ethics, screw my house, we're pushing this thing down. But there are just straight up turns of the game where it doesn't matter. You're like, I could see this going either way and not really matter. And the game sort of almost forces you to just be like, okay, well then what is the thing I care about? Is it getting money in this round? Is it like pushing for some sort of ethical or moral consideration just for the sake of it? I think the game threads the needle of giving you different reasons to care about the game or not at different times.
Yes, and that's the problem. Right? Because in a pure negotiation game, you know what everyone's goal is, which is to win. But if you're playing a negotiation game with people where Christina is more concerned that all the peasants are happy, suddenly you don't know with which framework people are negotiating. Now, that's not a problem, like, at all. And that's not a problem for people who enjoy the looser storytelling sort of it. And to be clear, I had a lot of fun playing it, but it's not satisfying to me in the same way that even a bad negotiation game is, because it's unclear from any individual game what someone was even trying to do, and it's like, oh, we protected the kingdom. And even the function, and I know we have this as a later talking point, where the game literally says, some things award you white crowns, prestige, some things award you black crowns, craven points, and both of those will be useful in determining the ultimate winner of the game. And so my house, most of the achievements of my house award craven crowns, and I lost every game of the King's Dilemma that we have played, literally 4th place, but that also gave me a bunch of black crowns. And it's very unclear to me right now whether that was actually within the spirit of my house or whether I'm just losing. Mm-hmm. And I don't think it's clear to any of us.
Yeah.
Right. I would agree with that.
I think that's a fair point.
And I'm not, sorry, I hope I'm not being too harsh on you. Like, sorry, I'm not trying to just say you're wrong.
No.
It's like my feelings are complicated.
Totally. I think that's a fair point. And this is actually one of the things I think that needs to be said about this game. That if you are looking for like a mechanically solid gamer's game, this probably isn't it, right? And one of the things I kept saying repeatedly like over the course of the evening was I kind of feel like the game wants you to at least have some investment in the story. Because otherwise it does kind of collapse at the seams a little bit. If you're just like straight up, I don't care about any of the stuff that's happening story-wise, I do think it's a substantially lesser game for it, because I will actually say one thing we haven't even really spoken about. This is one of the more interesting storytelling games in the way that it deals with narrative threads and introduces them over the course of the game, and they show up at various points and you're like, oh, we're back on this plot thread now. And then a couple of turns later, you come back to it. Like the way it inserts storylines into the game is kind of novel. And I think you kind of have to be in it at least a little bit for that side of it to get something out of it.
Yeah, I mean, I think the best moments were when that happened. My faction's narrative achievement, which again is not a spoiler, was to destroy ancient heretical knowledge, which we don't know what that means, and we have not discovered even an inkling of that in the first 3 games. But evaluating every dilemma by will this get me closer to that is kind of funny, because it's like, okay, let's argue about the grain, and I'm like, oh, hell no, let's go to that deep cavern that's covered in purple auras, because that's closer to ancient heretical knowledge. And so we spent the most time, I think, of all 3 games arguing over a decision that was literally a 50-50 coin toss. We had no way of knowing, and I tried to pretend like I had a way of knowing that I did not have. And it got absurd, and that was the funniest bit, but also, like, that was probably the most role-playing.
Maybe, yeah.
With that said, as someone who is really anticipating the King's Dilemma, I actually think I liked it less than I expected. And I think that that's probably colored by my overall opinion of legacy games, which, spoiler alert, is not very strong.
All right, well, that is a great segue into our main topic. So let's get into legacy games. So you mentioned, Kellen, that your feeling on legacy games aren't super hot. How has your feeling on legacy games evolved through the years? Were you always negative on them, or have you become more negative?
The promise of legacy games, right, is always the thing, right? Like the idea that your game will slowly change over time, that it'll adopt some of these video gamey elements. Risk Legacy is kind of one of the big first ones, and oh my God, you can rip up a card and like permanently change the game forever, and forever your distribution will not have South Africa as one of the countries in the game. Oh my God, that changes everything. In practice, depending on the type of gamer you are, I think that legacy games probably work best for non-hardcore board game people who are buying new board games once a month or once a quarter or twice a year, but are better for sort of like the family who discovers Pandemic Legacy and really just gets into that. I don't find the sort of decision between a winner of an individual game and the winner of the overall campaign, I've never seen it done in a way that is satisfying. We had a campaign of Charterstone going, the Stonemaier Games one, and it's sort of like once you discover how the final scoring works it's sort of like, well, why did I spend 7 games doing this thing when in reality who wins the ultimate game is that thing? So how do you value those wins? And I think many people don't care about winning as much as Board Game Barrage does, but I think that one of the things that unites us is the search for that W.
That's right. Neil, how has your feeling on legacy games evolved through the years?
I think that if anything, like when we started this podcast, like I was at the beginning of like a Gloomhaven campaign, and like legacy games were kind of this interesting thing that were like on the horizon. And I think one of the things that's unfortunately a little bit frustrating is a lot of legacy games have come and gone in the last 3 years. I think a lot of them have ended up being disappointing to a lot of people, like whether that's like the majestic crash of something like Seafall. But there are some core games like Pandemic Legacy, I feel, has mostly held strong amongst its adherents. My opinion on like legacy games has changed, or even just over the course of playing something like Gloomhaven, which I started 3 years ago. I think experiences like Charterstone, which kind of represent, as Kellen was saying, this kind of weird looseness, the problems of the genre, like exemplified, where you're uncertain about how your short-term goals match with your long-term goals. I feel like that's just become more and more apparent the more of these legacy games we've played. I think one of the things that's become apparent as I've played more of these is how hard it is to get that balance right. On that specific front, the balance of the value of winning an individual game versus how does this play out for me in the long run.
But even the balance of the game itself, right? Like we decry, that's a word, right? Decry? You can decry.
Decry, I think.
Decry.
No. You could decry, the balance of even just a regular standard Euro game, and then we're going to, talk about the balance of a Euro game that changes 17 times, and it's sort of just like this, that, or the other in terms of who's going to win what game.
Mm-hmm. As for me, I was always positive on legacy games when they were first coming out, when Pandemic Legacy took the stage. I was really excited about it. Kellen mentioned the word promise, and that was the word for me. I always sort of had this imagining of where these games could take you. I had this dream that it would take you on this crazy adventure where, like, your board would become like a circle from a square, and it would be this whole crazy experience.
Cut the board.
And I have really soured on that. And I haven't had, we'll get into this more detail later, I haven't had too many really negative experiences, if any, really. But they've become in general less something I'm excited to play and more of something I feel obligated to get to. So now it's gone from, when a game is being talked about as being a legacy game, a couple of years ago, that would have been something that immediately made me interested, made me imagine, again, this like, what could this game be? It could be this magical experience. And now when I hear a game as a legacy game, it's almost without fail a immediate negative strike against it. It becomes immediately a game that I'm less inclined to want to try out.
I think that thing that you're describing is something that was like most apparent for us as a group, as we've already spoken about in the context of Charterstone, where that sense of obligation was really kind of the only thing pulling us forward. And we got to a point eventually where it was like, well, wouldn't we rather just play other games that we want to play more than this one that we feel the need to complete? And that's the decision we ultimately came to like stop that campaign and be like, okay, we're not getting as much out of this as we want to be, so we should just be playing games we enjoy. And to be fair, one of the things that's so hard is about even in the discussion of a legacy game is just that sense that the agreement at the start is you will play 15, 20 games of this. There are very few games that we play 15 to 20 times, at least in the short period of time, which like a campaign typically demands of you.
Or collectively, right, with the exact same group of
Right,
players.
exactly,
Right,
exactly.
Yes. And, I mentioned that I haven't had very many negative experiences, and Charterstone is a perfect example. I think Charterstone has been like the worst legacy game I've played, but Charterstone was totally fine. I mean, it's like a 6 out of 10. It's a fine game, it's fine, but it became more of like do I want to play this fine, okay, average game 12 times, 15 times? No, not really. It's not offensive. It wasn't bad. It felt like something we were tied to.
God help me, though, I still can't help but feel excited about the idea. Like, again, like the golden idea that you described, Mark, of this could be something crazy, still keeps me going a little bit.
The square board could turn to a
right.
board. Imagine that.
And I think that that's the allure, and something that we were talking about when we were pre-gaming the episode, which is sort of like, if the primary excitement about the legacy game is determining what's next, then the legacy game has a problem, or at least to me has a big problem. And so Charterstone got to the place where it's like, well, I want to know what's in that box. And like that was what was driving the gameplay. And I find that to be the biggest problem, is like what could be in that hidden envelope is more important than the game-to-game gameplay.
Yeah. You mentioned game-to-game, Kellen. So a part of the Cinco de Ocho Part 2 festivities, we also played My City, the Knizia legacy game. And you mentioned earlier about what constitutes a win in a legacy game, and that being sort of more nebulous than it is in a straightforward game where you know this is most victory points, or a race game. You get to this, you win. Legacy games, oftentimes you're unsure of what... You may be sure of what's going to win a specific game, but what that means for the greater overall game, you're less clear about. So what did you guys feel about how the individual games played out in My City? And you've already sort of talked about this, Kellen, but in King's Dilemma.
My City is Reiner Knizia's legacy game, and each game is only like 20 to 30 minutes long. And it's a polyomino sort of flip a card. Everyone has to place that building on their city, and then your city slowly changes across the course of games. And the way that it works is it's divided into chapters, and so the game encourages you to play it 3 times back to back and then introduce another chapter. So it is a little hard to talk about My City, right, because we have only played the first chapter. But again, that's often the hard thing about legacy games, is you don't want to spoil and you want to have experienced all of it. I think that My City works well because it is short and not because it is good. And that is to say that the way that My City around ends, or a game ends, if you want to call it that, right? You could call it a 90-minute game with 3 rounds if you wanted to, is that the winner of the game gets 2... I don't know, there's a thing for it. Two white crowns, essentially. 2 points. The second place person gets 1 point, and those 2 players sometimes get penalized, right? They have to make their city worse, and then the people in third and fourth, depending, will get some kind of benefit with a sticker to their city to make their city better as a catch-up mechanism. So this was delightful to get through 3 games, with the exception of the fact that the first game was like baby's first board game, right? The first game was so inane that it was like, well, is this a game? And also there's no player interaction in this game. It doesn't matter if that player interaction comes in chapter 3, Reiner, like we need to be interacting with each other. With that said, the discovery of it is exciting. It's like, what's in the next envelope? This one, though, in comparison to the King's Dilemma, felt more, okay, I lost that game. I lost that game. But by the third game, my board was significantly better than Neelan's because Neelan had been winning the games. And so it's like, what does that even mean now, right? Because my board is way easier to win on than his.
I will say this, and I don't know if you guys will agree with this, but I did feel that, despite the fact that, in contrast to King's Dilemma, a game of My City is a much purer game of lay tiles, someone gets victory points, and there is a winner at the end of that game. Even though King's Dilemma has victory points, My City feels more discreetly like a board game that you're playing. I still kind of felt at the end of every game of like, okay, I don't care so much. I was still trying to win every game, but there still seemed to be this sort of like devalue on winning an individual game of My City. Even though there's no real reason for that if you just are treating them as a board game you're playing with friends. It's something about the overarching structure and not knowing where it's leading and what's going to change that in some way kind of devalues an individual game. I don't know why that is. It's almost just like purely psychological.
No, I agree completely with this. I will say that, I've played a handful of legacy games now. I think King's Dilemma and My City, I think it's way early on that one, so I don't think I have a firm grasp of what that game is going to be. I don't think it's revealed enough to show me where it could go. But it does seem clear to me that they're both solid legacy games. I think a lot of the stuff that King's Dilemma is so clever that I'm already sort of comfortable thinking that it's going to be one of the better legacy experiences I've ever had. But I will also say that we played 3 games of My City, we played 3 games of King's Dilemma, good experiences, but I couldn't help but feel at the end of the night less satisfied. I felt like what I go into board games to get, I didn't quite get from the games. And again, it's the whole competition to me. We had some incredible moments in King's Dilemma specifically where we were all laughing, we were all bantering at each other, but there was some emptiness there. There was something that was lacking in terms of like the competition and the sort of like results that I sort of want from a board game.
It's missing like a core that you value from a board game night.
Yeah. Right. So I had a great time, but it almost felt like I wasn't leaving like a game night. There was something fundamental missing.
Yeah, my hot take is that My City works extremely well with like 2 players. It doesn't really matter how many people are playing, and that the function of playing that with like your significant other over and over again, over the course of a couple weeks is better than us spending our time going through it when there's so many other better board games to be playing through. I also would stop the King's Dilemma if you guys didn't want to keep doing it, and we'll probably be pushing for us to do like a mega marathon of it at some point, like a 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. sort of thing, which will be like hellacious in its own right. I think it's enough for me to say like the sort of campaign / legacy game is just not for me, and I firmly move it into the same category as co-ops, which is I won't play it unless you force me to, or unless there's some reason. The King's Dilemma is everything that Kellen as a board gamer should want, with the heavy negotiation, with the big moments, with the over-the-top antics, and somehow for me it is not what I care about or what I am looking for, and all of the accoutrements of Legacy just add annoying things like, okay, now take out your character sheet and you're going to level this up, and then you got to save these cards in that slot and these tokens in there, and then I don't care. And it's not the purpose of a board game. The purpose of a board game is to open it up and to crush you and then to put it away.
It's so funny because I think I'm like so much on the flip side of that. And we spoke about this as we were playing My City, where like I am drawn to like, oh, what's coming next for this? Even if I'm not enjoying the moment to moment, this was a board game we played together, I'm still excited for like what's coming up. How is this going to change? Like, what is the arc of this over the course of the campaign? And that is almost enough, even if the game is weak, to buoy me,
Yeah, I mean, unlike Kellen, I'm very excited to continue with King's Dilemma. I'm also very excited to continue with My City. That one mostly because of how quick it is. The games run so fast that how much could it drag on? I feel like I'm willing to go through it for that. That being said, these experiences, as good as they've been, have not increased my estimation of legacy games. Like, I still see legacy as something that is, like Kellen said, a qualification that will put a game into the not for me zone more than anything. I mean, like, for example, Gloomhaven, the number 1 ranked game on BGG right now, among the best legacy game implementations ever, so much in a box, and a game that I was really excited for. I played D&D as a kid, so, it's even right up my alley in those respects, but there was such an obligation that I felt whenever we played it that it just became clear to me, like, if this is the best, and it is a super well designed game, but the best is something that is feeling like a drag to me, so this is probably not something that I'm into.
Yeah, I feel like I have to speak up at least a little bit in defense of Gloomhaven, because this still represents the high point for me. I don't think it's any surprise. I've spoken at length about how much I love the game, but I do think that the thing that Gloomhaven does specifically so well is, like, I think the idea of a good legacy game design is, like, nailing both these things you've talked about, like the micro goals of the scenario of the game and the macro goals of like the campaign, right? And I do actually think that Gloomhaven does that breadcrumbing, that like carrot on a stick really, really well. Like, it has all sorts of scales of little goals where like that dopamine hit comes from. I still find every scenario of Gloomhaven that I play like riveting. Like, that gameplay is solid enough to carry me through scenario to scenario. And then there's like, I want to see what's next for this character, and then I want to see what the next character is after this one retires. It just has so many levels of goals that don't detract from every game feeling like a really solid hand management dungeon crawl cooperative experience.
I've got a recommendation for you.
Yeah.
It's an American game show for like 12-year-olds. It's called Deal or No Deal. And you get to sit there and you get to go, what's in that briefcase? Oh my God. And then they open it. And so your curiosity is satisfied.
But like, that's not fair, really, because even in the context of Gloomhaven, like, I don't care what's like inside that box. It's not like, oh, I'm going to open this up and be amazed by the contents. Like, that's not it. It's different.
When have I ever said anything fair?
Good point.
All right, so let's wrap this up by all going around the room and saying what our favorite moment in legacy games have been. Let's end on a positive note. Kellen, you go first.
I don't know that I've had a good legacy game, honestly. And I think I do want to recuse myself. Is that another word I've made up?
No.
I think that's a word.
That's absolutely
recuse myself from... It's sort of like I now preface when I talk about co-op games in a very specific way, because co-op games are not for me. And so if co-op games are not for you, then you kind of know, oh, maybe this co-op game is worth trying, because there are some that sort of peak. Legacy games are now clearly in that camp where I am biased against them. I had fun on Cinco de Ocho, but I did have to remind myself after you guys left that it was worth it, because all we played was legacy games. And I'm like, no, you had fun, Ellen. Like, you did have a good time. It hooks into the TTRPG stuff that I have no interest in. It hooks into wasting time, which I have no interest in. You know, like, there's sort of a grind that's attached to them. And I do everything possible in my life to reduce that grind. I do think King's Dilemma has some funny moments. It's tough. It sucks to not be able to share, you know, how we were holding up cards to the light and sort of like shouting at each other and saying, no, go that way for literally no reason at all. And that was a highlight of the day. I had a great time with my friends, but not with legacy games.
I will say that there were, for me, a couple like very high moments for King's Dilemma. Cal sort of alluded to them, and again, we don't want to do spoilers, but there's a storyline that I was a big fan of, and whenever the storyline came back up in our decision making, I was very, very excited. And we had a couple of moments where I didn't care about which way the decision was going to go, and I found myself sitting sort of at the last place in bidding. So, you know, I had sort of the last say, and, you know, having in one case Kellen bid versus the combined forces of Christina and Neelan, and just going back and forth between them over and over again was hilarious and a lot of fun. So that was a highlight. Also, and this is, you know, the most cliche of legacy moments, but I'll never forget playing Pandemic Legacy Season 1, the original Pandemic Legacy, with a couple of non-gamer friends of mine. That very first time we broke it out, and, you know, I taught the rules, and then we got to the very first moment where it says destroy this card, and just very ceremoniously I took the card, held it above the board, and just slowly ripped it. There was a little bit of like a surprised look on their faces. I mean, I'd mentioned that we were going to be adding stickers and things would change, but I didn't mention that we would actually be destroying components. And that moment where I just ripped the card in front of everybody, I think it did for them sort of feel like we're going into uncharted territory. Like, what kind of game is this? And that's like the magic that I was hoping that legacy games would provide. But it's a situation where you've seen that trick, it becomes less and less exciting. But it was a hell of a start for legacy to me.
Yeah, I can like remember like what probably was my first moment in that direction of just kind of like the sort of not inane, but the gimmicky side of legacy games, which is like, you know, in Rise of Fenris, which is one of the expansions for Scythe. I played this with a friend who we are both huge fans of Scythe. And, you know, it's only loosely a legacy game, but it does have the opening boxes to reveal what is coming up in the new scenario. And, you know, the first time we opened one of these boxes, which it's hard to talk about without spoiling anything, but we were very surprised and very, very pleasantly amazed at the contents of one of these boxes. And it was just like, it was a big moment for both of us because of the way it changed the nature of what that campaign was going to be. I'm definitely still not immune to those, even though that enthusiasm dampens, like you said, the more and more you do it. But yeah, I think that some of the biggest moments for me in the context of Gloomhaven, for example, are when we've just retired and unlocked like a new party of characters. Because the way that we play our Gloomhaven campaign, we sort of retire altogether when the conditions are right. We sort of fudge it a little bit to make that work. So we were launching with a new party more often than not together, and finding the way that a new party of completely different characters works together, and then getting to that one scenario where you're like, oh, it's all just clicked. Like the combined experience of multiple games of this has now just clicked together, and this party is just really, really working well together, I think is super fun. And like that's the sort of thing that you only get through that repeated iterative style of gameplay.
Right. That's going to do it for our talk on legacy games. But before we end, we're going back to the bunker. That's right. This is another episode of Bunker, Battlefield, or Blown Away. For those who don't remember, I'm going to bring up the games we talked about a year ago, and these guys have to tell me whether the game is firmly in their collection, therefore in the bunker, whether it is in the collection, but they're not sure if they're going to keep it, so it's on the battlefield, or whether it's out of there and is blown away. So, a year ago, the games we talked about, and I'm not sure who talked about what, but I do know that Kellen talked about Zoned Out, and I know the situation of Zoned Out because I now have Kellen's copy of Zoned Out. So
you know that it's been blown away. Oh no, is that the
that's blown away? I just went over it. Come on.
This had fantastic table presence. I have not had any interest in playing it again. Blown away.
Next game on the list is Bronze Age. Kellen, this is yours too?
Yes, this is a John Cloudis game that is good and gets sort of compared to Innovation as a small Civ game. Christina keeps asking to replay this, the Blue Tank. I think we've returned to it just one time since we covered it on the episode, but it has not left my collection.
So is it in the bunker or battlefield?
Oh, it's on the battlefield.
All right. Next up is Santorini, which is the game I think I talked about. So. I enjoyed Santorini. I haven't played it since. I still have it just because I sort of like the abstract chess-ish game with powers that it is. Just haven't broken it out, but I am hanging on to it. It's in the bunker for me. And finally, Mini Express, which is a game I think we all played together.
Yeah.
Mini Express we played on TTS. My Kickstarter copy has arrived in the intervening years, and this is a really cool production in a very small box. I do think it would be helpful for us to kind of rapidly go through a lot of these shorter train games, because there's sort of the tried and true, Chicago Express, the new stuff, which is like Iberian Gauge, Mini Express, and Irish Gauge, to sort of run them all through the ringer and sort of crown the small train game that is the best. Because I don't think you need all of them, and that's part of the problem. There's also, a new one that has come out, which is Card Rail, and it's literally a standard deck of cards, and it's trying to be a train game with just a standard deck, which is pretty awesome as well.
So that one is in your bunker, sounds like. We got to keep the verbiage going. We got to keep it on brand.
But the thing is, right, your bunker is as big as a gymnasium. You know what I mean? And my bunker is barely a closet.
That's true. I would say that my gymnasium is more of a battlefield than a bunker. It's a large battlefield. The bunker itself is small. It's maybe the size of one basketball hoop.
You have no loyalty.
So that's going to do it for our episode. If you want to talk about your experiences with legacy games, why not go to our Discord? There are plenty of folks on there 24 hours a day chatting about board games. Why not go to boardgamebarrage.com/Discord, and specifically the podcast channel where we discuss the current week's episode. You can also find us on all forms of social media. We're on Instagram and Twitter and all that good stuff. We've got a pretty lively Facebook group for those who are on Facebook. And definitely check out our brand new wiki. Go to boardgamebarrage.com/wiki and see the pages people have put up. Maybe create some pages of your own. Why not? We've got a repository of all our episodes there. We've got pages for people in our community. It's a really, really interesting, ever-evolving site that I'm always excited to see the latest happenings on. Finally, a big thank you to Heart Society, as always, for our intro and outro song, What's on Your Mind, Kid? And until next week, see ya.
Bye-bye.
Good night. And goodbye, Legacy.
My name is Mark, the Red Tank. No, my name is Mark.
Excuse me?
I'm looking at my shirt. And
you're looking in your heart. So.
That's right.
The premise of Bonfire thematically is that you are lighting up these bonfires. It is sort of set in this...
Good luck.
Oh, God. This is not the right way to go with this.